Welcome everybody. Absolutely delighted that you can join us for CG's 156th webinar. I'm Claire Callender and I'm Deputy Director of the Centre for Global Higher Education, based at UCL Institute of Education. And I'm also Professor of Higher Education at UCL IOE and at Birkbeck. And today we're hearing from Professor Alexi Marmot and Dr. Zachery Spire. Alexi is Professor of Facility Environment Management and Head of the Bartlett School of Graduate Studies. She's an internationally acknowledged expert in the design, management, and use of places for work and for learning. Zachery was one of Alexi's PhD students. He's a postdoctoral researcher at UCL, and his research focuses on student residential accommodation, student engagement, and higher education. And today they're going to be addressing issues related to student accommodation, which is key for students, higher education institutions, towns, and cities. And arguably, this is absolutely clear within the current context of COVID-19. Student residential accommodation has been the site of contagion in some university towns and actually has got quite a bad press for HE. It's been blamed, rightly or wrongly, in the media for spreading the virus within some university towns. And these are some of the issues that no doubt we'll be addressing in the presentation. But before we start the presentation, there are a few brief housekeeping rules that I need to mention. Firstly, please note that this Zoom webinar is being recorded. And a transcript of the full chat function will be posted online along with a YouTube of the actual session. Please keep yourselves muted unless you're asked to speak or asked a question or asking a question. There's no need for you to have your videos on during the webinar, but please do have them on when asking a question. And we recommend that you use speaker view so you can more clearly see who is talking. That's a function at the top right-hand corner of your screen. Now, to ask a question, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen and write out the question you wish to ask. And then at the end of the presentation, if your question is selected, you'll be invited to ask it yourself directly. And when invited to ask a question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where are you from. I'll now pass you over to the presenters. Thank you. Alexi, would you like to kick off?
Just bear with me a moment.
You okay, or do you need some help?
No, I think I'm okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Lovely. Well, thank you, Claire. Delighted to be here today and to be talking to you about student residential accommodation. So just by way of background, I'll be taking a view that rather comes from the built environment side. I myself am an architect and town planner originally. But recently, a couple of years ago, I set up something in our faculty, the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment at UCL, which is called the Global Centre for Learning Environments. And just by way of background, what we try and look at there is really learning through its life course and the ways in which the physical environment alongside the digital environment, the social environment, the economic environment, and so on, the ways in which learning environments can be made better, made to improve and shape learning, effective learning through the life course. and delighted to work with colleagues in the Institute of Education and with colleagues such as Zach, with whom we've had some great fun talking at length about student residential accommodation as one of the aspects of learning environments. So we have to start, of course, with COVID. But that's not the only way in which student residential accommodation has come to the news in recent days. So here you see the latest data, I think from yesterday, on the number of confirmed cases and deaths in the world from COVID, already well over 1.1 million, depending on exactly which data source you look at. And it shows here by the size of the circle.
Sorry, Alexi, we can't see your slides.
Okay, bear with me a moment, please.
Alexi, I'll share your slides for you.
Hang on, if
No, it's okay, Alexi. Trevor will show your slides for you.
I think I've got them now. Can you see now?
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
apologies.
So Alexi, just say next slide, and I'll move it on for you. Time.
Is that yours showing now?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay. So could you move ahead, please? 2 slides. And 3. Yeah, next one. Okay, and now the next one after that. So as Claire's mentioned, there is controversy about how much transmission is happening in UK universities from student residential accommodation. This was actually something from yesterday's news, suggesting that 8 times as many people were infected in schools, universities and nurseries, places of learning, than in pubs or restaurants in England. Quite how good that data is, I wouldn't like to comment, but clearly places of learning can be sources of infection because of people being spatially close together, amongst other aspects. I'm sure that over time there'll be a lot more post-mortems about that. Next. Student residential accommodation is in the news a lot. Sometimes students have been asked to isolate in their own rooms, or at least within their own building, if an infection cluster has been found. So in this particular piece of news, from a few days ago, up to 1,700 students in one university in Manchester were asked to isolate. And of course, they feel very threatened. Their lives have completely changed and treated like criminals is their sense. Next. Other reasons for coming to attention of the public is, for example, in this case, in another English university, the University of East Anglia, the student accommodation has typically been in double rooms for 2 students. Because of the pandemic, a late decision was made that they could only be held by 1 student. That's a reasonable decision. But the students had not expected that they would then have to pay for both beds. But that's what they've been faced with. And of course, lots of controversies about whether or not it is the university that should be footing that bill, or the student who's perhaps benefiting from more space, or in fact only receiving the what they didn't want, which was loneliness, being alone in a room. Next. Away from COVID, unfortunately, again in England, we've had other problems in student blocks. Just last November, less than a year ago, this particular block, relatively recently built, caught fire, and the fire rapidly spread around the building. Fortunately, there was no loss of life and virtually no problems. It was treated very, very fast by the fire service, but the building has now been totally vacated while questions are asked as to why this happened, why the spread was so fast. This is a particularly sensitive issue in the UK because of a notorious fire that killed about 72 people in a housing block, and questions were asked as to whether or not the spread here was due to the same cause, which was an inflammable cladding. As it happens, it wasn't the same cladding, but it certainly seemed to have proved highly flammable very fast. Lots of court cases will follow from this one. Next. This morning in the newspaper, yet again, a block in London where over 200 students are accommodated as part of a development of over 900 beds. And they have been asked to vacate the block because of, again, problems with the speed, well, problems with the quality of construction. And that's possibly to do with the rush that we've had over the last decade in particular to very rapidly construct SRA units because there's been such high demand. I'm sure we'll hear more about the analysis as data comes out on this one. Next. So let's now, I've just alluded to the fact that there's been a lot of growth in the last few years for several reasons. So here I want to whiz through some data on the demographic issues behind the growth in SRA. Next. So clearly we have at the baseline, we have a massively growing international population. And this is a recent phenomenon. You know, for most of what we understand to be mankind's period on the planet, the population of the world has hovered at somewhere around 1 billion people. But since the middle of the last century, since the end of the Second World War in effect, the blue line is where our growth trajectory suddenly went. And so from having known about gentle increases up to 1.8 billion people on the planet 100 years ago, now it's well in the high 7 billions. It's probably about 7.8 by the latest estimates that I've seen, and growing. How much? We don't know. But these lines show three trajectories, and all of them certainly show massive growth for at least another 50 years, even if it then tails off, which is what many hope. Next. As part of that, of course, lots of young people have been born, and many of them have gone to university in increasing numbers. So again, here from 1970 till a few years ago, you see the heavy line, which is the overall increase in the tertiary enrollment ratio from about 10% of the age group to about 30% across the world. And in high income countries like the UK, it's actually the top line where it's at about 70%. In that case, we're talking about both about university education as well as higher level technical education. Next. And international students more recently have been a source of huge increase in numbers in a country like the UK. In particular, the olive green line shows the growing number of Chinese students within the UK in first year university level between 2006 and last year. Next. So with all of that growth in student numbers and students from abroad, the number of bed spaces has also been growing, but you'll see that it's not growing at anything like the same rate. And what's important in this slide is more the difference between the red and the yellow, the red being those spaces which are actually provided by mostly the universities in some sort of arrangement, sometimes with an outsourced company, and the yellow, which are provided by third parties. But the growth, the recent growth has all been in the yellow. Next. So behind that, of course, comes a lot of financial investment. Next slide. And this shows some of the data from one of the real estate companies, in this case, Savills, who are a very large international real estate company who monitor things like the investment level. So here we see the investment in billions of dollars over the last few years in residential accommodation for students. The US is the largest, the light green, then comes the UK in the dark green, and then comes the rest of Western Europe in orange, and then the rest of the world. So this has been a phenomenally large market over the last few years. Next. Another real estate company, Knight Frank, look at the comparison between the growth in GDP annually, which is shown in the green line, compared with the number of applicants for student residential accommodation. And you can see that student residential accommodation is doing much, much better in its growth than GDP, which is one of the reasons why private capital has been highly attracted to the sector. Next. And here we see the average rental growth per year, which for PBSA, student residential accommodation, then it's about 4.5%, whereas the retail price index or the rate of increase in office properties or industrial property rents have been far, far lower. And indeed, compared with retail, it's a really good investment, or has been a really good investment in which to put money. PBSA is, of course, purpose-built student accommodation. Next. And just recently, shortly before the virus changed everyone's perception of the future, one of the companies that had already invested heavily in student accommodation in the UK, a company called IQ, was sold to another investment company. 28,000 beds were sold because it was just such a good, it was seen as such a good asset class, and in a deal that was pretty phenomenal, $6 billion. Next. So what we see there is that the rate of return on investment has been something in the order of 5% a year, which is also shown in this data. But what's additionally interesting, and perhaps you can't quite read it, but when you look together with the capital increase in the value of the properties, it's actually been an annual return of in the order of 25%. Next. So now let's look at what we're talking about in terms of where and how it functions. Next. So there's been, we've already alluded to the fact that there's been a lot of international movement in students, lots of competition now to say which is the best student city or best student country. Next. London, we know, often comes out as one of the top, if not top. And London and the UK has a lot of good educational institutions and really not enough investment in accommodation for students. So most in the end take some form of private accommodation. Next. And behind it all is this cultural phenomenon in the UK, the cultural phenomenon that it's been a sort of form of a rite of passage to grow up by going to university and actually living in student digs, not necessarily going each day as a commuter student to have one's higher or other form of tertiary education. And that sort of cultural tradition dating back to the Oxbridge period has sort of informed the fact that, in fact, there are not nearly enough student residential places for all students, but there's certainly a higher proportion than in many other countries where a commuter higher education is accepted as more normal, for example, in Australia. Next. In the last few years, the expectations of investment in SRA places has been growing higher and higher. This is one very close to where Claire and I hang out, recently built. And it's built, how should one say it? It's more hotel than student dorms. It has good shared spaces, shared facilities, some shared sports spaces, and so on. But the rooms themselves are also of very high caliber and relatively spacious. One of the reasons being that it happens to sit in a part of London which, having seen the growth in this sector, decided that it had to control it, and it certainly had to make sure that spaces were in an area where there's housing shortage generally, not just for students, where the spaces should also be used for short-term lets when university holidays happened. So that starts to suggest all sorts of different demands on the accommodation. And that's been more and more a phenomenon of the public sector planning authorities intervening a little more in controlling the quality, the size, the type, and the location of SRA. Next. This happens to be some student accommodation in a very old Georgian building, but it's had a lot of investment in order to bring it up to the sorts of standards that students currently expect. Next. And the question is, what should be that standard, and how many billiard rooms and music rooms and gyms and swimming places, etc., are needed alongside the basic accommodation, the bed, the desk. Next. And this is just an example from London's plan trying to control SRA. Next. Some feedback from students, what really matters to them, location number one, and the ability to be with friends and other students. Next. And which of the following would they pay more for? The most important is Wi-Fi, fast Wi-Fi. And then come a few other things like the size of the bedroom or an ensuite gym or 24-hour security. Next. So we've moved on from the Oxbridge model to various forms, but exactly what that mixture is, which can come in all sorts of mixtures at the moment, but exactly how much is provided and exactly how actively it is managed by the HE provider is a much debated point. Next. And what I would add is, in the last few years, there's been a big focus on student wellbeing, student mental health, and particularly the British Property Federation, together with the Department for Education, recently, just about a year ago, produced a report on student wellbeing in purpose-built student accommodation. So this is now a topic that's rising to the fore for any new provider, manager of student accommodation. Next. So the research gaps, as I see, that we still really need more work on, next slide, is these issues. We need much more to understand the planning and design implications, the urban impacts, and that's a two-way flow, both the impact of the existing city on the students and how the students actually impact the city, which comes sometimes very positively and sometimes not so positively. University proximity is always something that's favoured. And then within the buildings, again, this balance of what's the shared spaces, what's the necessity of those, how big and how luxurious might they be, what's the study bedroom, how big, how minimal, and how much is actually put into it. We've seen some problems about safety in terms of fire and construction quality. And of course, environmental sustainability is important in the way we deal with all aspects of our lives, but the built environment sector is a very key component of that. The finances are critical. There's also been increasing amounts of student housing poverty and some of the tales of exactly where students are choosing to live because it's the only thing they can afford is really quite heartbreaking to understand quite how miserable, far away, and without decent facilities some of the places are. So the whole user experience and well-being and how it affects the academic side of studies, the social side of people's lives, and that whole sense of how do you actually grow up as an undergraduate, how do you actually thrive as a whatever level of student you are, and what is the role of accommodation in that is more and more a subject where there's a crying need for more research. Next. the end. Thank you so much for listening. And now I am delighted to hand over to Zach Spire, who knows a huge amount about SRA from many different roles that he's played over the years. Thank you.
That's great, Alexi. Thank you so much indeed. Okay, well, reserve questions that have been posted until after Zach has done his presentation. We'll take all the questions together. Okay, over to you, Zach.
Thank you. And first, thanks to CGHE, to Claire, Alexi, and Trevor for allowing me to be here and to be able to share my research with you. Alexi has done an amazing job of working through a lot of the drivers and the debates and tensions, particularly around student numbers, investment, types of facilities, and design of facilities. And I think it's really important. I make a sort of a go at this from the human scale. So my work is on student residential accommodation and student engagement. I studied 2 specific institutions in the English context. And for me, it's a matter of trying to understand how individuals, staff, and students experience, understand, make meaning of their time in student residential accommodation as part of participating in higher education. So just a quick overview. I want to present my primary research questions and the aims of my fieldwork, give you some clear definitions of what I mean by student residential accommodation and student engagement, give you a brief run through the history of this phenomenon in the English context, set a couple of approaches out that others have proposed on how to explore, understand, and make meaning of student residential accommodation as it relates to student or to higher education, sorry. And then to present my own methodology, my multidimensional relational approach, and some of the findings that I think are really important to have come from the institutes that I studied. And then maybe to pick up on a couple of things Alexi has already alluded to about the future of how to research student residences and their relationship to higher education. First off, what were my primary research questions anyways? Well, I really wanted to understand what drives institutions to provide student residential accommodation. Is there a relationship between the provision of residential accommodation and what I call student engagement, or what I'm calling student engagement? And what does student engagement mean to students and staff working and residing in residence accommodation at this time? And as I say, for my fieldwork, I wanted to sort of gather policy documents, existing literature and research on the study of student residences and higher education in the English context. And then I wanted to look at a couple of cases because case study seems to be the dominant approach to study student residential accommodation and its relationship to different institutions. And I wanted to get feedback from students and staff, and then to contrast what policy documents and existing research had noted in relation to what students and staff I spoke with said of the now. And as I say, uncomplicatedly, student residences are simply, for me, where students live while on a course in higher education, so defined. And student engagement I see as kind of a resource-based ideal where an institution and a student invest their time and energy and effort into what they believe are educationally purposeful activities. And I think that's really important because it requires, I think, a nuanced understanding of the value of feedback and the value of representation. When we talk about student residential accommodation, much of it is framed in relation to growing student numbers, massive amounts of private investment, for a long time, a massive amount of state investment, and how the changing substitution effects of private for public and shifts in student numbers might influence the supply, demand, distribution, meaning, and purpose towards student residences. So I'm not going to try to recover 8 centuries worth of history and the complexity of student residences across such time. I would just like to highlight, as Alexi has, the long shadow the Oxbridge model has given to our conceptualization and understanding of student residential accommodation in England specifically. And to also note that, as a number of authors, including Lawrence Stone, Stephen Hatch, and Joan Brothers at the Institute of Education during the Student Residences Project noted, before Oxbridge was the dominant model, Oxbridge relied on students sorting their own lodging out when they arrived at university. And then, through what a number of scholars have called tensions between town and gown, decided that it was both economically and socially useful to provide students with lodging and somewhere to live. And it has had a dramatic effect because it has been the way of doing things, or was the way of doing things, and is still the way of doing things in many respects for a number of centuries. As Harold Silver has noted, this proposal became tradition and now legacy in the higher education context of England. And it has led to a number of other divergent models and approaches to our formulation of higher education in the English context and further education, not the least of which how universities have provided different types or forms of student residences. For example, UCL started by providing student houses, where similarly King's College London was interested in providing halls similar to Oxford, carrying a number of the traditions Oxford had started into its own practice. And then considering, different areas like the civic universities, which in the main did not begin with providing students with housing because they were aimed at a more localized provision of higher education. Similarly, when you go forward several decades into the mid 20th century, you have the plate glass university, so called by Michael Beloff. And he notes, I think quite importantly, that the plate glass universities of the 1960s and early 1970s were the first meaningful attempt at engineering the physical orientation and design of the university estate in order to make some meaningful contribution to the way in which people could be together, and whether or not the buildup of social relations at a human scale would have a consequence or cascade into increased knowledge production through the building of new relationships, cross-disciplinary relationships, and finding value in the placemaking of people, if you will. And again, that carries forward, if you will, other examples of non-residence-based higher education in the English context, no doubt would be the Open University, which was, like the University of London, one of the sort of seminal examples of how distance education can be formed and serve and provide higher education in an aim or with an aim towards greater participation. As you can see in post-1992 institutions, similarly, we recategorized a number of polytechnic institutions into university status, but we did so without concomitantly offering support, as many generations had, from the University Grants Committee for the development of student residential accommodation. And that has had impacts, I think, on how universities conceive of, understand, and apply this idea of residence-based higher education. So you can see, and I won't stay here any longer, but you can see the planning and the policy and the practice have come from a deep reserve and respect of repetition and replication that reinforces the idea of residence-based higher education and student residential accommodation as a method of housing students, and residence-based higher education as one of the modes of higher education that continues to proliferate. Now, to go on to existing approaches to student engagement and residential accommodation, a number of scholars have studied the idea of what student residences mean to students, institutions, and their local towns, cities, regions, and more generally the nation. Clapham, in his housing pathway approach, was quite clear that he thought, as Alexi alluded to, the transition out of the origin home and into the wider housing field was an important one. And residences, student residential accommodation, was one typology that allowed students to do that in a very generally clear way without a number of the barriers or issues that non-students faced. And it was important, I think, also to see how that move of transition was equally represented by Blimling in his approach to student residences as student service. They're conceptualized, described, divided based on how they are a service to students. And now reflecting on what Thompson argued was a concern for students' preferences and satisfaction. Does participation in residential accommodation influence educational outcomes? Does it influence social outcomes and personal outcomes? If so, how so? And how does the provision of student residences respond to students' satisfaction and preferences in their housing types? And now you see the long line of questions around student characteristics and identities, and how, especially I would say now, as we are having a reflection point, a reflective moment in our history collectively, I think, around our health, our well-being, our identities and characteristics, and how we start, I would argue, generally as human beings first, and then work out how we will be together. And certainly it's an important conversation that I think needs to be had around what characteristics and focuses we actually say we will concern ourselves with and what we will not, because I think there's an important value in protecting the individual's ability to have agency and the individual's ability to be in these residential environments and feel comfortable and safe speaking for themselves amongst other peers and future colleagues. And as ever, a concern, as Alexi alluded to as well, for the local housing context and the influence of student residences on the local housing context. If we build a number of these buildings in order to relieve some of the pressure on local housing supply and demand, does it actually reflect in the future when students decide to stay or move back to their origin town, city, nation, if you will? Or are we building out from the capacity we are trying to create by bringing students, recruiting students, and trying to retain them in our towns and cities? So just thinking about all of this, as you can see, I take a very sort of multidimensional and relational approach to student engagement in and with student residential accommodation. I think it's built around relationships. I think it's about how the individual relates to themselves, how the individual relates to their built environment and to their peers and to the staff, that have a huge influence on the quality of students' experience in and with these built environments. And to take a more ecological, holistic view, which was the main, I think, for many decades, until we became, I would say, immersed in the questions around the capital value and investment value into these typologies, and how we carry that forward or change, reflecting back on what we could know from the past into the present. And I think also thinking about kind of the methodology and methods of my own research in order to do that, I was trying to be quite qualitative, and I was trying to focus socially on the cases I was studying. And I wanted to do that because I wanted it to be a sort of meaningful counterbalance to what I thought the dominant approach in student engagement in residential literature was, which was quantitative. And so I thought, a review of the literature showed me, and an interest in policy and the aims of policies was showing me, in my mind, that it would be helpful if we understood the humans within these places in order to better grasp whether or not residential accommodation did influence students' engagement with their universities, their educational outcomes, their personal outcomes, and social outcomes. So I went and I spoke to people. My first case was a post-1992 university on the south coast of England. For purposes of privacy and guaranteed anonymity, I regrettably cannot show you the building environments themselves. That's also why all of my fun photos are from Unsplash. But I went to look at this institution, and I found the opportunity to study a particular building or facility, and it's 5 separate quote blocks, and it is organized in a rather unique way. They are not around a particular quad. There's a number of quads and a large bank car park, if you will. And it's a very interesting building for both its physical context and for the organization that it has of the individual buildings and the buildings in relation to each other. And I interviewed 5 staff and 4 students. And then I asked students, based on that feedback, to fill out an electronic questionnaire across the piece. And I did a similar thing for the pre-1992 university I studied in South London. And I looked at a fit-for-purpose student residential accommodation. It too was a number of Georgian houses brought together, and it, or Victorian houses, I'm sorry, and merged through remodel. And I was able to interview students and staff. And then from that student and staff feedback, I was able to carry out an electronic questionnaire. What was really interesting is that one of the contributions of this research is it asked international students and domestic students, both undergraduate and postgraduate, who were participating in these two different types of facilities, about their experiences and engagement in and with the facility, the town, and the university at large. And there was some really interesting feedback to come through. The staff was focused on supply, demand, and distribution of university-provided student residences. They were also very concerned about first-year student experience of the university. To them, a university experience in part is defined by participation in residential accommodation, and that move culturally out of the origin home and into the wider housing and social environment. They also were very focused on students as customers, which they said was concerned with how students were deriving value for their investment and what was their residential life. Like, was the policy and practices and residential life team, both professional and student paraprofessional, giving students what they were expecting out of these halls of residence? And in the second case study site in South London, I was very interested to find that student and staff talked back and forth about how their relationship came to be, but the staff particularly focused on how their process and their practices aim to build relationships with their students and to create a set of expectations that were clear and concise and also achievable. So rather than overpromise and market their environment, they were very clear. These are the amount of days it's going to take to get a maintenance issue fixed. These are the amount of people that you can have in your study bedroom at any one time. And to focus, I guess, on that contractual obligation, the student was at the center of their discussion all the time, especially the well-being and mental health of students, because in this instance, international students were the primary group or population within the hall. And the staff were very concerned about their mental health and well-being being displaced or placed far away from their origin home and family or original social support networks. And they thought about policy planning and practice a lot because they saw the tension between the devolved power they had at the facilities level and its relationship to the administrative level. Now, jumping forward to the student feedback, accessibility and importance of SRA was hugely reflective in the location in relation to a student's most used facilities within their institute. They were also concerned, a number of students raised the point of personal development. I call it personal development, others would maybe call it life experiences. And they were very focused on how very unexpected or surprising moments in their journey into and through so far their halls of residence had really kind of had a big impact on their perception of themselves, their relationship to the hall and other people in the hall, and their approach to learning. They also were focusing on social networking. They thought that was really important. And they noted how a number of friends they had who didn't live in student halls, regrettably, didn't feel as connected either to a social network or to the university generally. And to really focus on tensions around policy and policy enforcement. One of the huge issues students raised was that they share a kitchen and there are rules around governing the kitchen. However, there's no enforcement. So it's a trust system and an honor code. And in a trust system and honor code, you respect or appreciate how your actions reflect on the experience of other people around you. And they were clear that a number of people in their minds had violated that expectation. And in the second case study, I found it really interesting that students sort of organized their feedback around the physical space, the social spaces, and the personal space. The physical spaces, the study bedrooms, shared kitchens, multi-purpose facilities, accessibility of computer labs, and how those touch points in the halls became the focus of why they were there. They were there to sleep, study, and eat. And then occasionally go to the library, or occasionally go out with friends, or occasionally go to a local coffee shop or pub or place of a eatery. And that they found that the social space was reflective of how they, as a local level, at this shared kitchen level, actually got on with each other. And I thought that was really interesting. And it also led to questions and debates around how, if you did not, what did you do? For a number of students, they sought social networking beyond their shared kitchen or beyond their flat or beyond their particular building or hall. And the personal issues that raised, one of the personal issues that it raised, when you have people traveling across a built environment that has different expressions of a small study bedroom or a medium study bedroom or a large study bedroom, in both the physical space it offers, the amenity quality it offers because it had been remodeled or upgraded at different points over the last 10 years. Students were very sensitive. They were paying for a particular room, and their colleague or friend was paying for another room, and it looked materially different to them. And that was raised a number of times. So the first slide I want to finish with is the significance and contribution of this research. So I thought it was really cool to be able to attempt to use a student engagement lens to explore and understand student residences, and to explore and understand staff and students' attitudes, perceptions, and experiences in and with student residential accommodation. A lot of the literature is periodic and episodic. Student residences are a huge issue, particularly when the state financial environment is under a lot of pressure, as now, both in the United States and in the UK, particularly in this instance, I'm speaking to England, or my example is England, but I know that a number of people are very concerned, and I am very concerned about the overall fiscal health of universities and the overall, as an extension of the overall fiscal health of our communities and our nations. And we seek well-being, and we seek flourishing as human beings. And I think that it's important to not totalize anybody's experience. And so my work, I hope, has illuminated the intra and intergroup contrasts and differences and diversity, not as a mechanism or means of saying, well, everybody is diverse and has different experiences, but as a nuanced or attempted nuanced way of understanding how those experiences can mean different things to different people. And also the physical environment as having a social impact, or having an impact on the social relations and a cascading influence on knowledge creation and dissemination in and beyond our universities and other institutions. And finally, in terms of the operational outputs, I think it contributed to institutional and professional service practice. It also contributed to understanding how institutional and higher education policy do and do not actually become enforced or act on each other, or dialectically in relation to each other. It identified a number of gaps, which I think Professor Marmot has illuminated and noted quite well, particularly around policies and practice and our ideal of the provision, our ideas of the provision, and the realities of those provisions, and the need to be radically honest, perhaps, about those realities now. Accommodation codes and issues of enforcement. This is raised by a number of scholars, both within the real estate literature and across the built environment literature and in higher education literature. Scholars who have noted that there are codes, but their enforcement is largely left to the institution and to self-governance and or responsibility for self-reporting if an issue arises with students, and leaving that to the institution and the students to know it is their earnest responsibility to take action as and when. And then the managing of student and staff relations remains the ever critical thing to me. I think it's super important that we understand the value of people to each other. And I think that it's also important to build relationships in a way that feels in equanimity and a sense of shared interest in the value of these places for our students and the staff members that form the majority of their day-to-day living amongst other peers in these places, and to really focus now on feedback and representation and operational quality going forward. So in the future, I hope we do a bit more work on this. I think there's plenty of time and space to give a go at it. I would love to see more work on additional cases of study. I would love to see local and regional or national comparative studies. I would love to see more qualitative and mixed methods research. I have deep respect and appreciation for the quantitative study of student residences and student engagement, particularly across the United States and Canada, the UK, Europe, and Australia, but I think that that needs to be balanced in its dimensionality with the lived experience of staff and students. And also, finally, to just note, as Professor Marmot mentioned, I think students' housing and food security needs to become a concern, not least of which because our staff and students are human beings, and their mental health and well-being rests largely on how we approach their overall being and our aim for it. And I hope that housing and food security continues as it is rising to get some attention and some focus and some energy. And I hope that all of it is to the better, the good, and to the support of people's ability to thrive and flourish in these places, in student residences and in universities and other institutions of learning at large. Thank you.
Well, great, a tour de force, both of you. Thank you very much indeed. We haven't got a lot of time for questioning, regrettably, but Rachel Brooks, if you'd like to ask your question first, then Caroline Chipperfield, and then assuming we have time, Vincenzo Rainbow, and then Carl Lee. So, Rachel, over to you.
Thank you very much. Rachel Brooks, the University of Surrey. A question for Alexi. To what extent do you think that considerations about student accommodation, and particularly the income associated with this, underpinned institutions' decisions to go ahead with some face-to-face teaching in the UK this year, despite the safety concerns that were raised by UCU and others? And I guess so it's also a question about the percentage of contribution student accommodation makes to university budgets.
A big question, Rachel, and it's a loaded one as well. It clearly varies by different universities, but you know, I think that the reason that halls have stayed open in some cases is there is demand, and a lot of universities have felt and certainly been urged by students to give as much of the traditional experience as possible. We know that students don't enjoy an all online experience nearly as much as a face-to-face one. UCL, which was fairly clear from early on that we would do all teaching online, at least till Christmas, a decision that was made, you know, in last academic year, has still found that lots of people wanted to come, even if they were going to then, you know, be in halls, but online. To think that it's about just, you know, the cynical need for income, I wouldn't accept that view. I would hope that that's not true in most circumstances. I very much hope that. And but to say that we really know for sure would be incorrect.
Okay, thank you. Right, so moving on to Caroline Chipperfield.
Hello, hi, Caroline Chipperfield. I work for UPE and I'm also a DBA student at the University of Bath. So this is my question for Alexi. Thank you ever so much for an interesting seminar. But as you mentioned in your talk, student accommodation is being featured in the media quite often, almost on a daily occurrence. So what do you think the long-term impact of COVID is going to be on the residential model of higher education? So as people get used to working from home, studying from home, and the increase in digital technologies become much better, what are your thoughts? Do you think this will have a long-term impact?
Well, it's a really good question. And again, there's no simple answer. I think what we have seen in the last few months is the most astounding experiment in whether or not distance learning can work. And amazingly, many of our systems have shown that at least the systems don't fall over, and don't fall over in many countries. That's not to say that it's the same wherever you are, or that in some cases people don't have the appropriate tools or don't have the money for a good enough Wi-Fi connection. But overall, it's been an experiment that shows that distance learning is far more possible than I think we ever imagined. What will be the long-term effect of that? I'm sure that at the margins, it will mean that more people study who otherwise wouldn't have, because they'll be able to study at a distance in a better way in systems where the delivery isn't just a recorded lecture, which is not anything like the experience of being there, but is much more a very rich experience where a lot of work has gone in every university I know of over the last 6 months to really try and work out many different ways of enriching the online to try and get it to be some semblance of the richness of a face-to-face experience. So I'm sure that at the margins it's going to make a difference, and hopefully that will open up the possibility of higher and further education to more people. But I think that we won't be giving up face-to-face teaching anytime soon as probably the preferred alternative. Face-to-face teaching may need, in the end, to start to match up to the digital, and that would be a nice problem to have.
Thank you, Alexi. Okay, and the next question for Zach from Vincenzo Remo.
Hi, thanks very much. I've really enjoyed the presentation today. I work for a student housing marketplace called Unilodgers. So this question actually may be an odd one coming from me, but I wonder if we're overly obsessed with student residential accommodation, whether that's accommodation provided by universities or purpose-built student accommodation, to the detriment of the majority of students who actually don't live in that sort of accommodation. You know, more students live with their parents than do in university accommodation or PBSA. And, you know, when you add that to those students who live in their own home, you know, mature students, postgraduate students, etc. And I think when we're in universities, we're obsessed with our student service provision to students who have a particular kind of experience, that residential experience, to the detriment of those others. I just wondered what you thought about that, Zach.
I would say, I think that's an amazing point. In the first instance, I think that I would point to the work of Liz Thomas, and before Liz Thomas, Ernest Rudd, who raised that exact point back in the 1980s. Ernest Rudd has a very famous, quite sassy and brief, but to the point, write-up about the challenges of focusing on the residential provision by universities to the detriment of, as you note, the vast majority of students who may not participate in this and certainly are not expected to after their first year in many instances, and to rebalance the conversation to be more inclusive of people who are commuting students or people. What I think is really interesting is SDSU and UCSD did a survey of their students when COVID-19 was impacting the start of their school year, and students said, listen, we're going to move out of our parents' homes, the people they surveyed. Mind you, we're not sure what the survey sample was, but we're going to move out of our homes anyways. So make a choice. Either you're going to provide this or you're not. So there's a clear logic for people who want to participate, and for those who don't, for us to respect that there's a number of people who won't. And I would never say my aim is to ever reduce anybody's experience or representing anybody's experience. I trust everybody to represent themselves. But I would also say that I appreciate immensely the need to destigmatize and elevate in our consciousness and get somebody at the table from those groups you're talking about. What I need is people at the table who want to talk for those people, or those people talking for themselves. For me, that's very important now.
Great. Well, I don't think we're bang on 3 o'clock. So I'm sorry, we don't have time for any more questions. I suppose to Zach's defense, I would say that for a certain group of students, the university provided residential is terribly important, namely for first years. We know that well over half of all first year students live in residential accommodation. And so it's likely to have quite an important influence on their overall university experiences, particularly in their first year. So, well, thank you so much, Zach and Alexi, for your really very stimulating presentation. And we look forward to seeing you on Thursday when there is yet another CG webinar. Take care. Thanks a lot for attending. Bye-bye.